The three states of the South Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, gained their independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. As these countries embrace new freedoms and democracy, how have they fared? Georgia and Armenia have been witness to mass protests, ushering in waves of new freedoms and making them democratic hopefuls in the region. Azerbaijan, on the other hand, has seen its governing family increasingly consolidate its control over the country. For a better picture of the democratic trajectories of these states, let's dive into the post-independence history of their governance institutions. Azerbaijan's political power is heavily concentrated in the office of the president. After the first two presidents, Ayaz Mutalibov and Abulfaz Elchibey, lost popular support in connection with their failures in the course of the Nagorno-Karabakh War that ended with a brokered ceasefire in 1994. Heydar Aliyev, a former KGB officer, was elected to the post in 1993. His family has maintained its rule over the country for the 26 years since then. In 2003, facing health problems, Heydar Aliyev appointed his son Ilham to the post of prime minister and mobilized the state apparatus in supporting Ilham's presidential bid in the October election of that year. Ilham Aliyev used the country's oil and gas wealth to bring economic growth. However, this newfound prosperity was also accompanied by rampant corruption and a crackdown on political dissenters and civil freedoms. After securing re-election in 2008, Ilham Aliyev called a national referendum to abolish the presidential two-term limit in the constitution, paving the way for him to remain in office indefinitely. The results of these elections and referenda were disputed by opposition groups as international observers highlighted gross irregularities. One particularly embarrassing incident took place during his 2013 re-election at the start of his third term. The Election Commission's official app declared him the winner the day before the election even took place. It was dismissed as a technical glitch, and the results the next day showed he won by an even wider margin. The main opposition parties united under the umbrella of the National Council of Democratic Forces, but even they didn't believe it was possible to bring change through the ballot box. They boycotted the 2015 parliamentary election because of the impossible political environment. OSCE ODIHR also refused to send an election observation team for that election after the Election Commission refused to admit a team of adequate size. In 2016, another constitutional referendum was held. It extended presidential term limits from 5 to 7 years, created the post of vice president, to which Ilham appointed his wife Mehreban Aliyeva, and lowered the age threshold for presidential candidates, seen as opening the door for Ilham's son Heydar II, who was 19 at the time, to eventually step into the role. On December 2, 2019, an early parliamentary election was called. It will take place in February 2020, only 8 months earlier than the normally scheduled October date. Some media outlets have speculated that it will provide an opportunity for President Aliyev to purge supporters of one of his advisors, Ramiz Meydeyev, who he recently removed from his administration. The early 1990s were marred by ethnic territorial wars in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, an armed rebellion against the country's first democratically elected government, and a period of warlordism and semi-anarchy. Fraudulent parliamentary elections in 2003 and the ensuing political crisis culminated in then-President Eduard Shevardnadze's resignation and the success of the Rose Revolution. The Western-oriented politicians of the revolution, led by Mikhail Saakashvili and the coalition of the National Movement and the United Democrats parties, initiated constitutional changes in February 2004, moving Georgia in the direction of super-presidentialism. By 2007, the authorities had been able to root out mass corruption, strengthen public institutions, and secure robust economic growth. However, the arrest of a former Minister of Defense turned opposition politician on corruption charges led to protests calling for early parliamentary elections and amendments to election legislation and the immediate resignation of the president. On November 8, Saakashvili unveiled his plan to resign, with a call for snap presidential elections in January 2008. Saakashvili won a second term in the pre-term presidential election in January. His United National Movement preserved its absolute majority in the May parliamentary elections that the opposition claimed were rigged. Tensions with Russia escalated over the Russian-backed self-proclaimed republics of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Sporadic exchanges of fire between Georgian forces and Ossetian militias escalated to a military confrontation between Georgian and Russian forces. 2 weeks later, Russia formally recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states, concluding military alliances with both regions. Parliamentary elections in 2012 resulted in Georgia's first peaceful transfer of power. After an aggressive election campaign, the Georgian Dream Movement, a coalition of 6 opposition parties led by billionaire Bidzina Ivanishvili, came to power. In the ensuing years, the Georgian Dream pushed legislation to strengthen judicial and media independence. Mikhail Saakashvili is indicted in absentia for abuse of office. In 2016, Ivanishvili stepped down as prime minister, and his longtime business associate Irakli Gharabashvili assumes the post. However, he too resigns ahead of the parliamentary elections. Prime Minister Georgi Kvirashvili, also a former Ivanishvili business associate, took up the premiership. Despite Ivanishvili's departure from government office, he remains active in Georgia's political life. Parliamentary elections in October 2016 were held in mostly free and fair conditions. However, instances of pre-election and election day violence cast a shadow over the process. Georgian Dream wins a super majority. Georgi Kvirashvili stepped down as prime minister in June 2018 and was replaced by Mamuka Baghdadze. Series of large demonstrations rocked the capital. The first in response to police raids on 2 popular nightclubs, and the second prompted by the partial acquittal of a defendant in a prominent 2017 murder case. A 2-round presidential election is held in 2018. Salome Zurabishvili becomes the first elected female president of Georgia. While the election took place in a generally peaceful environment, it was marred by allegations of vote buying, voter intimidation, and ballot box stuffing. This past year, Georgia has been hit with a series of massive protests beginning in June and continuing late into the fall after Parliament voted against promised constitutional amendments that would have changed the country's electoral system. Faced with the crippling devastation of the 1988 Spidak earthquake, the war with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh, an economic crisis, and an ensuing blockade by Turkey and Azerbaijan, the early years of independence for Armenia were challenging and traumatic. The first presidential election in 1991 was largely considered to be the only free and fair elections in the country's 27 years of independence until the Velvet Revolution of 2018. Up until that time, there were problems with systemic corruption, nepotism, impunity, and a flawed electoral system. Levon Ter-Bedrosian was elected as the country's first president. However, during the next election cycle in 1996, he was accused of rigging the elections to sustain his presidency, causing thousands to protest the results. The mass rallies were suppressed by security forces. Ter-Bedrosian was eventually forced to step down in February 1998 after advocating for what seemed to many as a capitulated settlement of the conflict with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. In March of that year, Robert Kocharyan, former president of Nagorno-Karabakh, who was the current prime minister of Armenia, was elected president, and snap elections marred yet again by irregularities and violations as reported by international electoral observers. One of the biggest blows to Armenia's statehood occurred on October 27, 1999, when gunmen stormed the country's parliament, killing 8 people, including the prime minister and the speaker of parliament. The shooting significantly impacted the political landscape of the country. Despite the political uncertainty following the shootings, Kocharyan was re-elected as president in 2003. Widespread corruption and weak governance endured as defining features of Armenia's political system. There was a rise in the number of assaults on journalists, political actors, and human rights activists critical of the government. The flawed conduct of the constitutional referendum in November 2005, aimed at redistributing power between Armenia's executive, legislative, and judicial branches, cast a shadow over the positive aspects of the amendments. In the presidential elections of February 19, 2008, Serge Sarkisyan, Kocharyan's protege, was elected as the country's 3rd president. However, Levon Ter-Bedrosian, who had been trying to make a comeback with a failed run for the presidency, took his supporters to the streets. The post-election protest devolved into a major political crisis, polarizing and stunning the country. On March 1, 10 people were killed and up to 200 injured when authorities used excessive force to disperse protesters. Outgoing President Robert Kocharyan declared a 20-day state of emergency. Over 100 arrests were made, and many were either convicted or still awaiting trial by the end of 2008. In the ensuing years, the legitimacy of the ruling party was extremely low, and social discontent was on the rise as the economy continued a slow recovery after the 2008 global economic crisis. At the same time, the opposition was weak and incapable of creating a viable political movement. In the presidential elections of 2013, Serge Sarkisyan was re-elected for a second term. However, the Heritage Party's Rafi Hovhannisyan achieved a record result of almost 40% and led protests in the capital city that died down a few weeks later. In 2015, Armenia's government initiated constitutional reforms to shift power from the president to the parliament and transition from a mixed electoral system to a proportional system. After a low-key campaign, the new constitution was approved in a national referendum amid reports of poor public understanding of the reform and violations on voting day. At the time, President Serge Sarkisyan promised that after his second term as president, he would not run for the post of the prime minister. In April 2016, Azerbaijan launched an attack of unexpected intensity on the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, which came to be known as the April War, and which had major political repercussions in Armenia, generating a public outcry around corruption in the military and damaging trust in the Armenian government's ability to ensure security. In the summer of that year, a group of armed men seized a police station in the capital, demanding the release of their leader, Zhirar Sefilian, and the resignation of President Serge Sarkisyan. They took several hostages, and in the aftermath, 3 police officers were killed. Transportation and electricity price hikes led to mass protests organized by youth movements and civil society. Consequently, the Armenian government backs down, which consolidates civic society. Parliamentary elections held in April 2017 saw the Republican Party of Armenia sweep the vote amid reports of major violations. In 2018, Serge Sarkisyan, the country's president since 2008, attempted to extend his rule in April by becoming prime minister under a new parliamentary system, prompting mass demonstrations across the country that came to be known as the Velvet Revolution and led to his resignation and the parliament's election of protest leader Nikol Pashinyan to replace him in May.